I hope you have a strong sense of how much people love the show.
Well,
I mean, they just have gone in deep and hard. And on Sunday nights, I just imagine that people are sitting with their own little cups of tea, talking to the TV, and then everyone spends the entire week talking about it afterwards. So thank you so much for all that you have brought to the show in terms of depth and purpose, and of course, historic accuracy. I mean, this show really does reflect your work and your spirit.
thank you. Thank you. Sunday nights, after about 9:55 p.m., my phone goes bananas. Like every Sun, and I always say the same thing. I know, keep watching. I can't, of course, reveal anything, but it's really I don't know. This season in particular has struck a chord with so many viewers, and I think what tickles me the most is that our viewership is growing across
Mhm.
demographics, across interests. People who you think wouldn't necessarily watch the show are totally watching the show. So
Yeah, they're totally watching it. So we are talking to Erica Armstrong Dunbar at a really interesting point in the run of this latest season. If you watched Sunday Night Show, you know that it ended quite literally with a bang. There is only one more episode left in the season. Is that correct?
correct.
So we're coming up on the season finale, and Erica has brought so much to this show: depth, spirit, historic accuracy, and we're going to talk to her about all of that. First of all, Erica, how did you get involved in this? Julian Fellows, who writes the show, also wrote Downton Abbey. Did you knock on his door? Did he knock on your door? How did this happen?
No, no, I did not knock on Lord Fellow's door. I wish that I had, had those kinds of connections. But no, back in 2019, when the show was sort of still in development, um, and I can talk a little bit about sort of the show originating really with NBC Universal,
Mm-hmm.
and then they're becoming a sort of partnership with HBO. One of the executive producers, David Crockett, had reached out to me, and he said, "Listen, I'm working on a show." It was very sort of not quite cloak and daggery, but I didn't know the specifics of the show.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, I understand you're an expert in African American women's history in the 19th century. And we have a storyline in our show that centers a Black woman in the 19th century. And I'm wondering if you'd be willing to take a look at some scripts and to weigh in on historical accuracy and to just sort of give us your thoughts. And I was like, "Oh, okay, sure." I had no idea what the show was. I didn't know the title of the show, nor did I know the writer. So, I signed a million NDAs, and then they sent me. I think it was two scripts at first, and I did what historian professors do. Like, I marked it up. I just read it and wrote sort of notes on the side and did a sort of light redlining, red line marks on the scripts. And I returned them. And that was that. I sent them to the producer. And shortly afterwards, I don't remember how much time passed, not much. I got a call from the producer, and he said, "Hey, listen, we really appreciated your comments and corrections, and the creator of the show would like to meet you." And I said, "Okay." And he said, "Julian Fellows is the creator of the show." And I was like, "Wait, freeze. Like, Julian Fellows as in Downton Abbey, like the show that I watch
Yes.
all of the time?" And he said, "Yes, he's the creator of the show." He told me the title, and he said, Julian will be up in Newport. We're scouting locations, and can we fly you up to meet him?
Mhm.
From I was in Philadelphia, and
Yeah.
I said, okay, I'd be happy to. And so, it was a quick visit, and I showed up, and that moment when you think you're just having a meeting, but then you walk into the room and you realize it's a job interview. It was sort of
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Julian, as well as several of the other creatives, producers, were sitting at this table. It was very kind of like heavily wood paneled in Newport, Rhode Island. And we just started kind of talking about his vision behind the show and his vision in particular for Peggy Scott
Mhm.
and the decision to focus on um, a Black family. And he asked me, he said, I've read this book called Black Gotham, um,
Mm.
that
Mhm.
follows the life of, I said, I know, Philip White. And he said,
Mhm.
oh, you know the book? I said, yeah, well, my friend Carla Peterson wrote that book. And he was like, oh, okay, so you understand? I said, yes, it really sort of, it's a family history that talks about kind of Black New York, more specifically Black Brooklyn
Mhm.
at that time period. And so we talked, and the next thing I know, Julian said, well, we would love to have you join the team. And I said, sure. And I literally walked out, and I called my husband. I said, I think I just got a job. I don't really know what I'm doing, but I'm assuming I'll be like doing history stuff. And so, of course, later on, I came on originally as a historical consultant
Yeah.
and someone who was, I would argue, doing kind of sensitivity reads
So
for
we
that.
should say that every week we see your name prominently as co-executive producer, and every time I see it, I just yelp a little bit. I am so proud of you.
Thank you. I sort of feel a little bit like Jack the clockmaker in that I kind of got the promotion
Mm.
at that time where I came in as a consultant, just kind of weighing in on historical accuracy. And then over time, I was kind of working more with the creatives on the show, and I was promoted to a consulting producer.
Mhm.
And then over time, again, I was promoted to a co-executive producer. And, for anyone who is a historian and academic like me, this is stuff that just doesn't happen to us
Well, can I interrupt
at
there?
all.
For anybody, even in Hollywood, to make that leap. I mean, executive producer titles, co, full, whatever it is, they are not handed out like candy. It is a rare thing. And so it says so much about the importance of your contributions and your
Thank you.
centrality in the show. So when you met Julian Fellows, he had imagined Peggy Cook already. How did you help him fill out her storyline and her family? Where do we see your contributions in her story?
Yeah, I think I feel comfortable talking about this now in part because Danae Benton, who plays Peggy Scott, has been very vocal and transparent
Mhm.
about the changes in Peggy's storyline. And what I'll say and what I said to the creative team back in 2019, 2020, is that it's my job and my mission and my goal to represent Black people in ways that are authentic and truthful. Um, and to be very honest, I saw this as an opportunity to do television around Black people
Mhm.
at a certain moment in time with a different kind of storyline that we haven't seen on television. And as someone who focuses on the 19th century, and in particular, the sort of stories of slavery and the afterlife of slavery, this just seemed ripe with potential.
Mhm.
And Danae Benton, I met fairly early on, and we talked a bit, and she was also very vocal in helping reshape the sort of the character arc of not just Peggy but her family.
So
And
from what to what?
so originally, Peggy was slotted to be a domestic.
Mm-hmm.
And while this was a very, as a historian, I understood this to be, this was very realistic, that
Mm-hmm.
the majority of Black women who are working outside of the home in New York were domestics. And there were, especially in other places across the nation, because there were very, very little opportunity anywhere else. But thinking back on Carla Peterson's book, Black Gotham, which Julian had read and liked, um, we were able to help suggest that perhaps a domestic wasn't the best way to introduce a Black woman
Mm-hmm.
in the 19th century with this specific family. Now, there were also very real intricacies in the story that had to tie to Peggy's involvement and interest and engagement on 61st Street. Like, okay, what's a Black woman doing in 61st Street? Eventually living with the Van Ryn family, um, and it really became clear that we could do it leaning on real historical characters and writers in particular, and so it became clear that Peggy could inhabit a space on 61st Street, not as a domestic, but to come in as a secretary, which was still a staff position, but a respected
Mm-hmm.
one that implied literacy, that also would give us and Julian a way in to write a story about a woman who was aspiring to be a writer and a novelist and journalist. And so Danae and I really, we had conversations with Julian, with the other creatives, with the network, and they all agreed that it was a great opportunity to do something that we had never seen on television before, and to be very honest, one that I felt like Black folks would watch.
Yeah. Was this
I
in the wake of George Floyd? Was there a strange, I don't want to use the word dividend because that would be so wrong, but an awareness about widening the aperture in Black life, and perhaps a curiosity that didn't exist? Because we do know that there was just an appetite for Black stories, Black books, Black films. Did that play a role in this at all?
Yes and no. We had already
Hmm.
kind of made the decision that we would change Peggy's story arc, and Julian was writing that. And this happened, we were sitting at our first table read, March, March 10th or something around then, 2020.
Hmm.
We were slotted to begin production very soon, which of course did not happen
Hmm.
because of the
Right.
pandemic. So there was a pause, kind of, that was horrendous for the world, fortuitous for the show, and that it gave us more time to rework, reimagine. And I think that the murder of George Floyd just drove home the importance of the need for these kinds of stories. So it did not reshape it, but I think it just kind of put an exclamation point on what we already sort of knew. And once again, the pandemic gave us time, gave Julian time to write. We brought on another writer as well. Sonia Warfield is a Black woman
Hmm.
who joined the team. And so that by the time we started shooting, which was October of 2020, which, to be very honest, was still pretty scary because there
Hmm.
were no vaccines yet. And what I will say to HBO's credit is that not one person got sick. We were so fastidious about testing, about um, uh, preventative actions that, they were digging in my brain, like every time you went on set, while you were on set, when you after set. So
You mean with those, you remember when they used to do the test with those Q-tips that were
ooh,
like 2 feet
that
long?
went to your brain. You were like, did I just see that Q-tip? That was the only way we could ensure the safety of our actors, who could not be masked during their scenes. So we shot pretty much all of season 1, or much of it, during COVID.
Wow.
And when the show premiered, we couldn't have a premiere party because it was Omicron. Omicron
Mm.
came back and messed everything up. And so um, that when we got to season 2, there was an actor and writer strike. And so we didn't have a premiere then. And so it
Yeah. So
really
this is
was.
amazing that what you've had to plow through to get
Yeah.
this on. I want to ask you about the building the characters.
Mhm.
And it's interesting because they're leading parallel lives. I mean, Peggy comes from people of means. And you see that in her carriage. You see that in the way right from the beginning, when the two of them meet at the train station and develop a friendship. But there's this interesting thing that's going on is their homes are similar but very different. They dress similarly but very different. The color palette is different. Part of that is because the Van Ryn sisters are older and a little bit fusty, if I can use that word. They wear a lot of lace, and you kind of have a arsenic and old lace kind of feeling in that. And the rooms are always really dark. Even then, there was the 18th century version of the 19th century version of bling among the Black characters. They just, in a recent episode, Peggy came out in this like asymmetrical gown that looked like, is that like, I see hints of Wakanda in that or something. So, can you just talk a little bit about how you helped them, and props to the fashion designer on this, who's done
Yeah,
such
gotcha.
amazing work.
Yeah.
But can you talk a little bit about what you brought to historic accuracy, and not just who the characters were, but how they present in the world, their clothing, their homes, their speech?
Yeah. And it's so, yeah, shout out to the costume department, and Kasha, who's the lead costumer, she's done a magnificent job with everyone. And in particular, understanding the subtleties of fashion and representation for Black women in the 19th
Mm-hmm.
century. And as you suggested, we see Agnes Van Ryn and Ada presented in a kind of older, perhaps more conservative dress and appeal and adornment, we'll
Mm-hmm.
say, right?
Mm-hmm.
Their
And
home was,
Bertha is like, whoo.
and Bertha's like, hey, I'm new, I'm here, like, let's
Mm-hmm.
go, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not about that life, I'm about this life. And
And hope you can keep up.
yes, good luck. and and what I think is great is that we've been able to, just through presentation of adornment, show where these families are coming from, what they're attempting to be, what they're attempting to present,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so for the Scott family, which is still going to be very trapped in what we would maybe call the politics of respectability in the late 19th century. Arthur Scott had been enslaved himself, and his wife had not. But they have climbed their way up to what we would call the Black elite in the late 19th century. And so some of the colors and like daring fabrics that we see a Bertha wear, aside from the fact that she's super loaded, like she's got money, right? That's not necessarily something that Black women in 19th century New York would feel comfortable wearing, in part because of the history
Mm-hmm.
attached to Black women, their bodies, and being seen, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, especially in respectable circles. So, the understanding that one needed to be adorned appropriately with colors that weren't too loud, that would not draw too much attention.
Mhm.
And we have to think also about how that was a nod to the need for protection of
Yeah.
Black women's bodies,
Yeah.
right?
And we
Uh,
should say that at that time, there were a lot of immigrants coming to America who would have been very jealous of the Scott family
of
and all
course,
that they had acquired.
all that they had acquired, and whether it was sort of new immigrants or you know, white Americans who'd been in this country for a long time, that would be adding fuel to the fire of jealousy, of anger, of misplaced jealousy and anger. And so the kind of more subtle, refined nature now doesn't mean that Black women couldn't step out and couldn't,
Mhm.
show themselves in ways that were just gorgeous. And one of the things that costuming does is they have storyboards that come in and I look at them, and they're, photos from the Schomburg and fabrics and everything attached that sort of narrates what Peggy or Dorothy and now Elizabeth Kirkland's
Mhm.
wardrobe will look like over the seasons. And I say that's a story in itself, right? So if you think
Were you
about,
relying on pictures and photos
oh
from the
yes, most
Beinecke
certainly,
and from the Schomburg and
yes, most certainly, everything from style, bustle size, to now, of course, there's some liberty taken because it's Hollywood and because we can and because people want to see a pretty dress.
Mhm.
But I will say, if you look at Peggy's attire in season one versus where she is in season three, it's very different. Season
Mhm.
one, we meet a woman who is attempting to put her life back together. She has a secret. We don't know what that
Mhm.
secret
Mhm.
is. She has been off on her own in Philadelphia. Shout out to Philly.
Mhm.
And on her way back to New York in an uncomfortable position with her family, estranged from her father, and a little less bling, a little, she's
Mhm.
much more
Mhm.
understated because she'd been kind of doing things on her own. And it isn't really until we move into a season two when she's established in back in New York. She's living with Agnes and Ada, but of course she's back home, back and forth to Brooklyn, and you kind of see Peggy's wardrobe tick up a notch or two. So by the time we hit season three, and she's actually courting someone or being
Mhm.
courted by
Mhm.
season three. There's a splendor that I think we've all been waiting to see, and it kind of is telling the story, I think, of a butterfly who is waiting or about to come out of her cocoon.
So you mentioned she's being courted by someone who's based on an actual character. Mr. Fortune was based on someone who was real. So how much liberty did you take in creating characters that were totally fictional? And we meet real characters, that are
Yeah,
coming through, particularly in the women's suffrage movement and in
yeah.
the temperance movement. How much liberty did you have to draw upon actual history, and where did you actually do that?
Well, beginning with T. Thomas Fortune, I think once again, there's a real responsibility that I feel as a historian to present our characters, those that are fictional, but especially those that are non-fictional,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
In ways that are as close to accurate as possible. Now, with all of our characters on the show, we take a little bit of license,
Hmm.
right? With T. Thomas Fortune, I will take a little bit of credit for suggesting that we needed him as a character in our show, in part because we know that our many of our white characters are like kind of composite characters. The Russells are that, but we have, of course, the Astors and
Hmm.
this season J.P. Morgan, and people who those are recognizable
Right.
names, people who were living. And originally, we did not have that for our Black cast. We had, composite characters. And T. Thomas Fortune was a way to tether the story to a real person and to a
Mhm.
person who was extremely important in the 19th century. He was the kind of journalist daddy of in New York. And really nationally at that moment. And so, given the desire to have Peggy want to be a writer, it made total sense to bring him in. Now, with that said, it's not a documentary; it's a drama, and
Right.
so we are going to take license in some places, but we are mindful of reputations, of status, and we don't want to malign
Mm.
someone's characters if they are like we're a real person. And so much of the storyline around Fortune and who he was and what he did, all of that is accurate, even down to like the kind of printing press that we had to bring to location, which weighed like I don't know how many tons. So we literally had the crew had to go in and re-support the floor with more
Oh
beam.
my goodness. It was that
in-
heavy.
yes, in order to support the printing press, which you see in season one
Yeah.
when Peggy
Yeah.
walks in to meet him. So those things are accurate. But once again, Peggy is a fictional character. So
So because that was my next question. Is she a totally fictional character, or were you pulling a little bit of this and a little bit of that to create that character?
she's a fictional character based on some of our kind of trailblazing Black women writers at the time, like Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who we
Hmm.
see in
Hmm.
season three, little Ida B. Wells.
Hmm.
Um, so in some ways she's that, but no, she is a fictional character, but we'll call her kind of composite.
And
And
what about
so
her parents, Arthur and Dorothy? Are they
her
composite
parents
also?
are
Was there a black pharmacist in
yes,
Brooklyn
yes,
who is based, who Arthur Scott could be based on?
yes. His name was Philip White, and he was actually, I believe, it's the great grandfather. Ooh, forgive me, Carla. In Carla Peterson's book, it's her ancestor.
Hmm.
And while it's not exactly the same story, it's loosely kind of based on the fact that yes, he was there. He went to pharmacy school. He had multiple locations, and he was a prominent businessman. And so, yes, all of that, all of it is grounded in, the work, the research that I do to kind of help inform these characters in the show. And so with Fortune, to be honest, when in season two, when Peggy and um, T. Thomas Fortune go down to Alabama and they are confronted with racial violence. Um, there's this moment in a barn where they kiss. And it's the only kind of inappropriate moment between the two. And there was a lot of talk about, okay, how do we do this without crossing the line, without damaging his reputation? And once again, it's fictional, but also look, in terrifying moments of danger, people do things that they don't necessarily imagine or wouldn't have
Hmm.
done
Hmm.
when they are not confronted with maybe this is it. Like
Hmm.
this could be it. And T. Thomas Fortune had kind of shot off his mouth in the restaurant, and they had to like get out of Dodge
Hmm.
quickly. And he did have a kind of a bravado about him and a righteous indignation, where he sued a hotel that refused to serve him. Right? He
So you're
was
actually talking about the actual T.
the
Thomas Fortune,
actual T.
actual.
Thomas Fortune.
Mhm.
Yes. So this is all informed by our T. Thomas Fortune, played by Sullivan Jones. That was, that's kind of who he was. And then they're in this situation where, they're being hunted, and they're not in New York, and they're in a barn in Alabama,
Mhm.
and things happen, right? And so for the dramatic purpose, we needed that to happen. There was a kind of, you saw from the beginning, there was a chemistry between the two of them. And then, though it was important, I think that that was dialed back. Like a recognition once that danger was over. Okay, how do we have these two in close proximity? How do we have Peggy, who by then, America loved,
Yeah.
and to with the kind of reminder of her mother, who was like, I raised you better than that,
Mm-hmm.
to set things straight. And so back to the original question, which was, the representation of our real characters and those that are composite or fictitious. I think it's important one way or another in terms of their presentation, but we can't get trapped in this idea that these Black people wore capes and they were perfect
Mm-hmm.
and they didn't mess up and they didn't have inappropriate thoughts, and even though they're the Black elite, that they always moved and lived and functioned according to the rules. That too is inauthentic and
Mm-hmm.
inaccurate, right? And so we're walking that line of trying to present a different image that we haven't seen on television before, in a way that shows the failings of human beings,
Mm-hmm.
but also the strength. And also, I think this season in particular, there's a different tone
Yeah.
to the Scott storyline.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned the Black Elite. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But it must be wonderful to be able to give someone like Sullivan Jones a dossier, basically saying this is the character you're portraying, and this is how he walked, in the earth, and this is what he did, and this is what he looked like, and this is what he wore, and what a wonderful gift to the actors. In terms of the Black Elite, one of the things that was a little bit revealing and also kind of heartbreaking as a viewer was to see in Arthur Scott's character a man who had risen from slavery to prominence. Wonderful. But the way that he was looked down upon by other Black people because he once was enslaved. That instead of, they didn't necessarily see all that he had done, they saw all that he was and stopped there. And that folks were already dividing themselves, based on that, based on skin color, which is a huge storyline in season 3, is heartbreaking. In a moment when we're stepping into freedom as a people for the first time.
Yeah, it is.
Heartbreaking, but I assume very accurate.
It is. And I think, once again, when we made the decision this season to do more of a story that focused on the kind of intra politics or intra relations between Black folks, which we could only really do by expanding the cast, which we did, in a way that's just been absolutely grand. And I think gives real
And it just
teeth.
keeps going. I mean, Leslie Uggams, suddenly I was like, is that?
Yes.
Yes, it is.
I mean, and just, for those who haven't seen yet, just her, and she's worked with Ms. Rashad before. So
Mm-hmm.
they have a relationship. And, and let me stop and say, being on set with Felicia Rashad and Leslie Uggams and Audra McDonald and Danae Benton and, Brian Stokes Mitchell, it is
And
a
Christine Baranski, and
oh, I was just talking about the Scots. I'm not even talking about everybody else, right? Which then just makes you feel like you're on Mars. But
mm-hmm.
it is otherworldly. And as a, middle-aged historian who spent her life reading, writing, teaching Black history, to suddenly kind of be in this position when you're on set and working with the fantastic Sally Richardson Whitfield, who's directing and producing. And she'll say, Erica, come here, tell me, da, 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 is this, that, how should he stand? Those are things that most academics, don't imagine will come into our our wheelhouse at any moment, and nor did I. But what I will say is this: as a historian, and I write and I teach. People are going to read my books. People are going to sit in my classes, but I will never have 4 million people a week, or 5 million people, or 7 million, however many it is, who are tuning into a show. I won't be able to touch that many people ever. And even if I can do it in the smallest of ways and say, okay, creative team, we need Frances Ellen Watkins Harper in this. If we're going to talk about suffrage, this can't just be about white women and suffrage, but there's a way to integrate someone who, as a writer, was fantastic, who, as an activist, was fantastic. If people hear that name, if they hear T. Thomas Fortune, if they see Booker T. Washington played, before he was Booker T. Washington, right? Then I feel like I've done something, that I have introduced these characters and this history into the mainstream, the most mainstream way of the kind of American cultural landscape. And some people will like it and some people won't, but I feel like, it's like when your mother used to give you medicine with a little sugar sprinkled on top. I feel like that's sort of what we get to do with the Gilded Age.
Yeah, well, it doesn't feel like medicine. It feels like protein. It feels, really, really, really wonderful. An observation: the Van Ryns, we learned very early on, had been supporting Black causes in Pennsylvania. They had been supporting the free school, and this is a show that really is all about the tensions between old money and new money.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you're making a statement there also, in that the people who were part of the old money, she notes that they'd been there since the 16s, whatever, when they arrived. But new money people were so worried about being accepted that they perhaps were less willing to support some of those causes. And I'm wondering if that was a moment where money didn't flow in that direction, support didn't flow in that direction, that there was less, energy that moved in that direction because the new money crowd was so worried about establishing themselves that they didn't actually support some of the causes that the old money generations were willing to support, particularly when it came to people of color and maybe new immigrants, maybe even the women's movement.
Yeah, I think I'm glad you make that point, because it's exactly what we're trying to do, which is, because Agnes and Ada are older, and we can tie them. Season 1, they make it very clear that their father was a patron of the Institute for Colored Youth, which later on became Cheney University. That we're making these kind of early connections. We could call them abolitionist, connections in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, way before the show. And that there were New Yorkers and Pennsylvanians and people from throughout the North who were invested in notions of reform, whether it was abolition, whether it was the right for Black men to vote, whether it was suffrage. And so there's a way that we kind of tether Agnes, who doesn't necessarily seem like she would be someone, interested in that camp. But we get to be sort of surprised by her over and over again. Even her relationship with Peggy is somewhat surprising. There is a respect that, and a respect for the grit that she sees in Peggy. That it's the only way this relationship can work. It's the only way that a Black woman in 1883, for can live on 61st Street. Like,
Mm-hmm.
if you notice, there are no Black servants in the
Oh,
Russell
I
household.
noticed. Yes, I noticed. I noticed. And
And
I asked that question with Bertha in mind. Would she ever, would she ever invite a Peggy into her world? Or would she be concerned about what Lady Astor would say?
more than likely, she would be worried. But remember, we haven't done a deep dive yet on Bertha's background. We've done a little bit. We've met her sister in season 3. And so I think when we know about a person's roots, then
Mm-hmm.
we can make kind of better assumptions about them. But
It's,
at first glance, we see there's no one Black working in the
yeah,
Russell household,
yeah.
and that wouldn't be unusual at all. That would not be unusual for the wealthiest of the wealthy, right? And there's a difference in scale when we look at the home that Bertha and George are living in versus what
Mm-hmm.
Agnes and Ada have. There's wealth, and then there's wealth, new wealth too,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And
yeah.
so we get to see the only way that it makes any kind of sense, and even still a little bit of a stretch to have Peggy living with Agnes and Ada. We had to make it a way that it was somewhat believable. And even still, sometimes there are moments where it's like, really? Okay. But we do our best. We do our
Well,
best.
they said yes pretty quickly. I know the weather was bad and she couldn't, get to the ferries weren't running, but it still is hard to imagine that the Van Ryn sisters would get to yes that quickly. I love the way that you have teased out Bertha. I think you're going to have to come back and talk to us again, maybe after the season finale. We'll have another conversation about this, because we know that Bertha, we intuit that Bertha has probably been to Sorrow's kitchen and licked all the pots, and she is never going back there again. So, she is pure ambition, not just driven by what's in front of her, but what's behind her. She's not going back there again. And I look forward to knowing, what she left behind. And Mr. Russell has a little bit of that in him too. And we're seeing that little bit of that street fighter in him in season 3. One of the surprising things also is the presence of Blacks in Newport.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's not just a contrivance for the show. That actually is historically accurate as well.
It is. I mean, we spent a lot of time when we made the decision that season 3 was going to incorporate more Black joy. Season 1 was very heavy when we find out Peggy's secret.
Mm-hmm.
Season 2 starts off super heavy because we're basically going to meet the gravesite of her child who had been given up for adoption against her knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And we and then there's, Alabama and the reminder, and Tuskegee was important because it's like, all right, we have this show about what's happening in New York and this small group of Black folks who've, accumulated some kind of wealth, but the rest of the country is kind of living more like
Mm-hmm.
this. It was important for us for that to register for authenticity's sake. And by the time we hit season 3, it's like, okay, a reminder that it doesn't have to be dark all the time. It's a reminder that, look, even in the midst of oppression and the rollback of rights that had come out of Reconstruction, which is happening right at that sort of moment, that Black people didn't walk around every day, all day saying, woe is me, and, I can only think about this. No, people lived and they loved and they went to church and they danced and they had great meals. And yes, their lives were touched frequently by the indignities of racism, of violence, but that we needn't show that all of the time. And to be honest, what I hear from viewers is that they're like relieved, like they want to see that. It's not a negation of what also was happening. but it's an attempt to allow us to think about the storylines that our white characters, focus on. We look at, Elizabeth Kirkland, and how is she, different from Bertha, from someone who is trying to manage their children's future, right? And Newport, when I was reading the actual Globe. So part of what I do is I'll like read through the 1883, 1884 articles in the Globe. And one of the things I saw over and over again was that, it would announce when Mrs. Jones goes to Newport, or Mr. Williams returns from Newport, right? And so it was a sort of trigger, like, you know what, we're in Newport with our other storylines. Why can't we be in Newport with the Scots? It would make sense. And so there's a significant amount of research on the sort of small yet important community of Black folks who lived and worked, and some summered in Newport, and that there was a growing entrepreneurial class there, that in part, because it became a sort of resort location,
Mhm.
we know that opportunity in terms of labor always opens up with that. So, but it was also a place in which discrimination, of course, existed, but it didn't feel as oppressive, as much of the thumb on the scale. By the 1880s, the schools were desegregated, that,
Mm.
begrudgingly, but they were. And so there was a way, I think, for us to step into leisure culture this season for Black people. And we did that not just through Newport, but also through the baseball game, like
Mhm. Mhm.
sort of reminding folks that, yeah, people went to see baseball games, and this is the precursor to the Negro League. So, and there was, of course, and all of this is, factual. There were Black baseball teams that played one another across the nation, and it was a way, once again, to remind our viewers, like, this too is everyday life for Black people. It isn't just step being followed in Bloomingdale's, like
Mhm.
we see in season one,
Yeah,
or being
yeah,
told to
right.
leave, right? But
There
that,
was that too, but you balance it, you balance it beautifully. I went on social media and asked some of your fans of the show to send in questions, and I got to let you go, but can we do a speed round where I just
yes,
present
yes,
you
yes,
quick question, quick answer?
sure.
So uh, I don't know if you know Brittany Packnett Cunningham, but she is a huge fan of the show. I know you know who she is probably,
Yes.
but she is all over the socials talking about the show. She thinks that there should be a fan club, and she has several interesting names like the RHOGA
The Real Housewives.
of, or the Gilded Girls, or the Guild. But she sent in several questions, so let's just tick through a few of these quickly. Was there any pushback to include the storyline of the Black Elite? Sounds like no, because you've answered that. Julian Fellows actually wanted to do this from the
From the
beginning.
beginning,
From
from
the
the beginning.
beginning. What are the messages or lessons that the Scott and Kirkland family storylines can teach Hollywood and even the whole country about including Black perspective throughout a production, and not just on camera, but behind the camera and on several levels within the story? Quick
Oh, I
answer.
think that's a fantastic question. And what I'll say is HBO got it right. And they understood that it can't come from one Black writer in a writer's room,
Mm-hmm.
that it has to happen systemically. So there have to be historians, writers, producers, directors who are who are coming from, who have a back, not just that they're Black, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's important,
Mm-hmm.
but that they have a portfolio, and they're coming from a place that allows for a compelling story that's accurate, and that is kind of beautifully woven into an American tapestry. And I think this should be the model going forward.
Love that. She also wanted to know, are Miss Van Ryn and Mrs. Kirkland are Mrs. Van Ryn and Mrs. Kirkland ever going to interact? Or can you say? You can't say. Okay. All right. Moving. um, Someone who I don't know the name, but they're at the Book Lush wanted to know if you have book recommendations about Black society in that area. You already mentioned Black Gotham.
Yeah.
What you mentioned some of the books you use for research. Is there a curriculum? Is there a place where you might post some of that? Is that something you want to share with us, and we can post and give people a syllabus if you want to learn more about that?
You know what? That's a great question. No one has actually, not from the network at least, talked about a syllabus. That usually we do that, as writers with
Mm-hmm.
our books and what have you. Um, so I haven't. I've been reading scripts, not thought about
Okay. Well, we'll come back to you on that because we might be able to just post something here at Say What, and if people want to find it, they can find it.
Yeah.
Um, was the criticism that Downton Abbey was perhaps too white a reason that Julian Fellows wanted to incorporate a Black storyline? Was this an answer to some of the critique that he received on Downton Abbey?
To my understanding, no. I think that he understood this is an American show.
Mm-hmm.
And to do a story, and I've said this in a couple of other interviews, that to do a story about New York in 19th century America and not have Black people would just be like false. So I think from the very
but people have done it. It doesn't mean it hasn't
yeah,
been done.
and it would and that is problematic. And
Yeah.
I think that you know knowing that he wanted it to be something that incorporated a Black elite that existed, he also knew that he got support from people like me, like
Mm-hmm.
Sonia Warfield, who's writing with him, and Sally Richardson Whitfield. So I don't necessarily know, or at least I wasn't told that this was a response to
Mm-hmm.
critique. It was presented to me as this is an American show, and we want it to be authentic. And HBO is you know, pretty good about, when possible, being as authentic as can be.
Okay, so a couple other quick round of questions. With so many Broadway stars all over this cast, is there any talk of a fever dream episode with music? That's from Fisher Mommy.
Everybody wants that, is what I'll say.
Okay.
Meaning all of the viewers want that. I think I love the format we have now. If Julian was to decide to do something different, we'll see. But I don't know. I kind of feel like everybody's sort of loving it. Does like everybody there can sing. Everybody, like, I don't even hum when I'm on set because
Do they sing offset? Because we saw the wonderful video of people doing the line dance in costume, which was just so delicious. It made my day. But do people just break into song when
they
the
play
characters
around.
break? Yeah.
They play
We'd
around.
love to see there should be some back content. I think that folks would really love to see that. Mitch Half, MICH dash half, wants to know, would Peggy and her friends really have been invited to the Van Ryn house?
For the suffrage meeting.
Yes.
Is that
Yes.
okay. Yes, the answer is yes. And we can trace that all the way back to, when we think about people like Harriet Tubman, who, following the Civil War was very invested in things like suffrage, like assisting the poor. And she frequently went to white people's homes, white women's homes, and spoke or participated in talks to either raise awareness and sometimes money. So, because of the relationship that Peggy has with Agnes. And once again, this is one of those moments where it's like people are like, "Were they really going to have her up in the?" And the answer is yes. Would it be with frequency? Probably
Eh,
not.
probably not.
But
Okay.
it is not beyond the pale of believability that would happen, because it did.
Would the Kirklands likely have had staff? And will we ever hear about them? That question from Kim Cut.
Well, we see two, I think, staff members. Well, we see their governess,
Mm-hmm.
who gets a chiding by Elizabeth for allowing the children to be
Mm-hmm.
outside
Mm-hmm.
without an umbrella,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yes.
And I believe we see a butler type. We don't have much interaction with him the way that we get to interact with Ellen, the Scots
Mm-hmm.
maid. But yes, most certainly they would have had staff. They did have staff. We tried to.
Storyline there that might deepen in season 4, because I'm assuming there will be a season 4.
Yes, we were renewed for season 4.
Mm-hmm.
We
So
were renewed.
storyline there. We'll wait and see. Okay. Another quick question. This from Tress409. I love people's names on the socials. She said, "Is there a lighting issue or intentional darkening of Audra's character to give distinction between the families?"
No, I don't think there's a. I mean, here's the thing. Lighting in the 19th century. Remember, this is right at the moment
Mm,
when electricity has sort of not just been invented, but there's a small commercial use for it, but very few people have electricity in their homes,
mhm,
right? So we're in rooms that are lit solely by candles or lanterns, gas lanterns, right? And so, you know, it is somewhat jarring that it appears like there's a darkness, but that was kind of specific to the time. There's a darkness in Agnes's house all the time, right?
mhm,
There's
mhm.
a darkness in
And they're
this.
always coming to collect the lamps at the end of the
They're
day.
oh,
There
I
is.
mean, because that's what you did, right?
Mhm,
But I will say this: I think in when we see Dorothy outside or in different venues, there's more clarity. But there is no darkening of anybody.
okay.
It has everything to do with period lighting.
Okay, last question, and then you have to promise to come back because we didn't get through all the questions, and I'm certain that after next week's episode, people will have even more. So, last question for now: did Americans wear tiaras?
Yeah, they wore tiaras.
That's
I mean,
from EAPE Pecklet. I couldn't
yes,
see
I
that
mean
there. Yes.
the fancy ones, the fancy ladies at the balls and the galas, but and I'm not sure the exact year that sort of falls out of favor. But even into the 20th century, you could catch somebody with a tiara, at a gala or at at a sort of important event. And
Mm,
so, what's interesting is kind of the difference between what American culture versus British culture. And we see more of that because of Gladys's
yeah,
move,
yeah.
right, to England. So there'll be more of that back and forth.
Where the rooms are also dark and big, and they seem drafty to me, even though
And
I'm not even in
cold,
them.
and they
Yes,
got mice.
yes, yes.
and
Nice.
and what I will say is Julian knows this better than anybody
Yeah.
else, right? As someone who is familiar with British history.
Well, hats off to him. And thank you so much for joining us. I have so many other questions, so we'll do this again because it was so much fun. I can't wait for the season finale. And I'm so glad, I say this over and over and over again. I believe that history has an energy and it finds the right conservators. It finds the right people who will take care of it and push it forward and make sure that we can examine it and interrogate it and and understand it. And in this case, history found the right conservator in you. So thank you very much for all that you've shared with us and with the show. And we'll talk to you again. And for now, it's not goodbye. It's just so long until next time.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.